This is the second part in my series of blog posts on why the Roman Empire fell. To recap, being a resident of the empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries brought powerful advantages for Roman citizens and even non-citizens. A consistent set of laws protected individuals and property. Transportation and communication within the empire was easy, with all that implied about exchange of goods and ideas. The Roman army protected the empire from attacks by barbarians. Infrastructure was quite advanced, with fresh water, efficient sewers, and public baths within cities, and well-maintained roads connecting the far-flung corners of the empire. A numerous middle class lived in comfortable homes. From the late 2nd century on, some of these benefits were eroding, making living in the empire far less appealing, and that's what we're looking at in this blog post. First of all, there's a change in the type of ruler. The emperors from Augustus through Marcus Aurelius, who died in 180 AD, called themselves princeps and paid lip service to the old republican forms of government. That implied that the emperor was the most important member of a group rather than an entirely different class of person. By the late 3rd century, however, the emperor was an absolute monarch on the old Eastern model, like the rulers of ancient Egypt and Persia. Diocletian, who's on the right, ruled 284 to 305. He proclaimed himself Dominus et Deus, ruler and God. He created a new imperial image, aloof, semi-divine, as much a symbol of a ruler as a portrait of a man. There's also a change in the role of the army. During the early empire, the army protected the empire from barbarians beyond its borders. By the 2nd century, emperors began to rely on it to keep themselves in power. This had two important effects. First, the army realized its own political power, and factions within it began to overthrow emperors as they saw fit. In the 50 years, from 235 to 285 AD, there were 26 emperors. Only one of them died of natural causes, 1 out of 26. Ambitious men and insecure rulers sometimes tried to win the army's favor by allowing it to plunder territories within the empire. The composition of the army changed as well. During the Republic, so before 31 BC, every citizen had to serve in the army for 10 years. Under Augustus and the later emperors, service became voluntary, with a 20-year term. But if a non-citizen served in the army, then he was granted citizenship, so that was a powerful incentive. In 212 AD, Emperor Caracalla enfranchised all freeborn residents of the empire, regardless of race, origin, creed, language, or military service. The incentive for military enlistment abruptly disappeared. Because the citizens of Rome and other urban centers didn't want to serve in the army began to be recruited from border areas. Eventually, even that source of soldiers dried up, and the emperors had to pay barbarians to come into the empire and keep other barbarians out. The barbarians generally rose to and fell from high positions, including the throne of the empire, too quickly to absorb Greco-Roman culture and pass it on. A civilization, in the sense of a body of shared ideas and values, can't survive if those who are living it don't know its past or care about its future. All right, let's look next at the change in exchanges of goods and ideas. During the Pax Romana, that long era of peace in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, transportation, communication, and production were much improved. As a result, once exotic goods were now often produced locally. The quality might be inferior, but the prices were significantly lower. Even knowledge was distributed more widely. By the end of the 3rd century AD, much, if not all, of the collection of the great library at Alexandria had probably been destroyed. But by then, every major city in the empire had its own libraries. Rome had a couple dozen. So, by the late 2nd century, trade with distant points of the empire for goods and ideas had become less essential. That meant that it was not so important to be part of that empire. Next up, a change in government actions in the 3rd and 4th centuries. During the early empire, local governments were semi-independent. Local officials were responsible for collecting taxes for the emperor. If the officials collected more than the total that had been set, then they made a profit. If they collected less than the total the emperor had told them to collect, then they had to make up the deficit. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the army was powerful enough to demand more pay, so the emperors increased taxes. Not surprisingly, when taxes rose sharply, far fewer locals were willing to serve as tax collectors. The emperors had to send out bureaucrats to run the local governments. Those hired bureaucrats meant higher administrative costs, which meant higher taxes, and so the cycle continued. Because the Roman government desperately needed money, it began debasing the currency, adding silver to gold coins, copper to silver coins, lead to copper coins. Under Septimius Severus, who ruled 193 to 211, silver coinage was about 50% silver. Under Gallienus, who ruled 253 to 268, so 50 years later, silver coins were copper with a silver wash, 5% or so by weight. And here's the problem. It was not uncommon for the government to use those debased coins to pay for goods and services, and then refuse to accept those coins as payment for taxes. So debasing the coinage ruined many middle-class businessmen and farmers. Increasingly oppressive government actions led to further unintended consequences. Shopkeepers and workers who couldn't make ends meet were quitting their jobs. Under Aurelian, who ruled 270 to 275, membership in a guild was made compulsory and hereditary. Those performing jobs that were considered essential to the government were made involuntary government employees. Among them were municipal officials, ship owners, and sellers or processors of grain, wine, and oil. In 301 AD, wages and prices were fixed by Diocletian. The penalty for violations was death. In 332, tenant farmers were legally attached to the estate they worked on. If they fled, they were brought back in chains like slaves. So, by the time of Diocletian's reign in the late 3rd century, the emperor was an oriental despot with no restraints on his power. He could use brute force on the citizens of the empire, many of whom were slaves and beggars. The emperor's power rested on the army, but the army was fickle. So, doing a cost-benefit analysis, by the early 4th century, being a citizen of the empire was no longer a great benefit in terms of goods available. With respect to taxes and having a say in local government, being within the empire was becoming a burden. For those living on the borders, the empire was not necessarily a protection, and its soldiers might even be a threat. In the next post in this series, we will look at philosophy and religion during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.